Now, I'd say the next steps are first, we need to do the real call when we are trying to load in the list of devices, right? Because this one now is using a mocked version. So we are going to perform the API call to the scan endpoint. And remember that one, in my case, is very slow. It takes about 20 sec because it's trying to resolve the host names one by one. Now I'm trying to load it here. While it's loading, let's talk about step number 2. After we perform the real calls, there we go, here the results. So you guys see it takes a little bit of time, so we have to consider that when implementing the user interface, we have to give some feedback to the user. Okay, the other part would be to go back to the tests and start thinking about how we can mock those API calls, because the tests we had end-to-end and unit, they were using the static version, so pulling from static data. What we want to do is to mock, and what I wanted to show, which is interesting, is how to mock the API calls. So let's do it. Let's start from creating the real API call here in the use case of loading the Wi-Fi devices. It's going to be sort of using the same approach. And then probably I'd say that goal number 3 could be to start refactoring a little bit, because soon we will see that we are going to duplicate the code of performing the fetch. And also we don't want to have, as discussed previously, the fetch call directly in here. So let's get to it. So here's what we're going to do. This code of the loading devices use case, let's use instead this one that I prepared. You can see it's very similar to the loading Wi-Fi. We are calling the scan instead of scan Wi-Fi. So this was the scan Wi-Fi. We are calling the scan endpoint, and then check if there's an error, stuff like that. And then we are returning the list of devices. So pretty much similar. Again, we're using the domain model here. Let's save it. I also want to point out that this is an important part. We need to pass a parameter, like a get parameter, containing the BSS ID of the Wi-Fi network. So that the endpoint, the backend, knows which Wi-Fi we are referring to. For that, I had to update a little bit the backend. Here I'm opening my backend machine. As discussed, it's sitting on another machine. So the scan method is going to get a BSS ID identifier. And then what I'm doing here is simulating the check about if it's an allowed Wi-Fi or not. Because obviously I can get access to the devices just on my Wi-Fi's. So I have hard-coded the allowed BSS ID to my ones. For now, what happens is that the BSS ID is passed from here, from this call, right, to this one. And then, okay, I'm printing it, but it doesn't matter. Essentially, it's checking if this BSS ID is in the array of allowed BSS ID. Once that is done, if this BSS ID identifier is part of the allowed ones, we perform the costly scan network. Otherwise, we just return an error like unauthorized BSS ID. So let's save it and let's test it. Oh, important point. I also had to modify here the execution parameter, the parameter of this execute method, to be BSSID instead of the network name. It is to be SSID, but as we know now, as we learned from our mistakes, the real identifier is this one. And so the context itself also here, where remember where we are reacting and observing the selected node, we need to pass the BSS ID instead. So cool, everything is saved. Now let's see if this call is performed correctly. Let's open the inspector. Let's go and see the network tab. And let's give a good refresh. I can see something already undefined because it's trying to load it when the page is loaded, which probably we don't want this call. We're going to address that later. Let's start selecting a network where we don't have permission. So we should see an error. Good. So this one, we got unauthorized. I'll make it a little bit bigger. We get unauthorized BSS ID, but now let's go to my one, which are this and that. I think, yes. Let's go to this one, boom. The call is being performed. It's interesting, I think it's still loading and we don't have the response. But here we should see the list of devices coming anytime soon, if it's working. Let's wait a little bit more. Boom, it works. So guys, this is the real thing. So this is the real data. It's literally the devices that are connected to my Wi-Fi network at the moment. It's very exciting. Boom shakalaka moment. Yes, so what's the story? I would say that the time, it's insanely long, but this is not front-end related. Although we can use this delay, this inefficient behavior to think about the fact that we need to display some kind of feedback to the user interfaces. So that would be one thing. And also, now that we have the real API call as discussed here in these two endpoints, we can also update our tests to use to be able to mock. Because if we run the test as things are now, it will use the use cases which will perform the real API call. So for example, the end-to-end test would try to hit the API, which would take forever, and probably we don't want that in certain scenarios. So I would say I will show you guys how we can mock those API calls next.